Welcome, dear mentors and Diamanten. We are privileged to have Ranjit Hoskote with us today for the 5th lecture of the series. Welcome, Ranjit, officially. It's about situating translation, anamnesia, resistance, cosmopolitics, with 2 commas in between. Ranjit Hoskote is an Indian poet, art critic, cultural theorist, and independent curator. Ranjit has been seen as extending the Anglophone Indian poetry tradition established by Nissim Ezekiel and A.K. Ramanujan. So, and he also plays an important role in shaping the contemporary art discourse in the international circus and within India as well. Ranjit, among others, has been honored by the Sahitya Academy multiple times. So the Golden Jubilee Award and Prize for Translation. And I think in 2022, he received the 7th JLF Mahakavi Kanhaiyalal Sethia Award for Poetry. So now I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Milind Brahme. Welcome, Milind. Dr. Milind Brahme, at present Associate Professor for German at the Humanities Department at IIT Madras. He was recently appointed DAAD Research Ambassador for South Asia for the Humanities and Social Sciences for the period 2022-2025. Milind studied German at Ferguson College, Pune, and at the Center of German Studies, JNU, New Delhi, where he completed his PhD in 1997 under the guidance of Professor Dr. Rajendra Dengle, titled Wandern ohne Ankunft. His doctoral thesis was a comparative study of the literary work of the Marathi writer G.A. Kulkarni and Franz Kafka. After teaching at the Center of German Studies, JNU, for more than 5 years, Milind has been on the faculty of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences since 2003 at Madras, IIT Madras, as I mentioned, and is teaching courses in German language and literature, literary theory, and criticism. Milind has been a recipient of numerous scholarships, notable in this context being one from the Goethe-Institut, Pune in 1986, which in fact triggered the interest in studying Germanistic. Then the other two, the DAD Sandwich Model Fellowship for Doctoral Research at the University of Göttingen, and the Franz Werfel Stipendium of the Österreichische Austauschdienst for postdoctoral work on Hermann Broch at the University of Klagenfurt in Austria. Milind has been associated with the Goethe Society of India since its inception, serving as Joint Secretary between 2004 and 2010, helping organize conferences in cooperation with the DAD and various departments of German at universities in India, and helping with the production of the Society's yearbook. He edited in the 2007 volume of Goethe Society's yearbook titled Translation as Cultural Praxis. He has been part of successful research initiatives in the area of multi-grade, multi-level, and inclusive education in cooperation with Rishi Valley and the Institut für Sonderpädagogik of the University of Würzburg, Germany. I request Milind now to take over and introduce Ranjit. Then Ranjit will give his lecture, Milind will respond, and after that we'll have the open round of question and answers. Over to you, Milind.
Thank you very much, Jayashree, for that very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be part of this particular lecture in this lecture series, where we're going to listen to Ranjit Hoskote. Situating Translation, Anamnesia, Resistance, Cosmopolitics. That is the title of today's lecture. Translation has assumed a vital and urgent role today in the context where linguistic practice must confront the often flattening and homogenizing effects of digital culture, as well as repressive forms of politics that impose unitary and centralizing conceptions of culture on societies characterized by diversity and polyglossia. This is just the beginning of the abstract that Ranjit had kindly shared. I don't think I need to introduce Ranjit Hoskote as such. He's a poet, translator, cultural theorist, and curator based in Mumbai, author of 8 collections of poems, including Central Time, Jonah Whale, The Atlas of Lost Beliefs, Hunch Prose, Ice Light, and he's an acclaimed his acclaimed translation of the 14th century Kashmiri woman mystic poetry has appeared as I Lalla, the poems of Lal Ded. I will stop here and ask Ranjit to take over with his lecture on situating translation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jayashree, for the very gracious invitation to participate in this series. Professor Brahme, thank you very much for consenting to be the interlocutor. I look forward very much to our discussions today. And I want to say, before I say anything else, how fascinated I am by the topic of your early work, Wandern ohne what is the matter with me? I suddenly have stage fright. Wandern ohne Ankunft.
Genau.
And it occurred to me that in a way, as we said when we exchanged emails, that is really the sign under which we all operate. We're, if you will, condemned to wandering without possibility of arrival. But we are also threatened in that situation by people who have, as it were, a Reise mit Ziel. They have a program, they have a goal, they know the destination. And I'm going to situate what I have to say really in the context of these two alternatives. I'm going to take for these present purposes this idea that on the one hand you have the possibility of wandering without possibility of arrival, and what demands does that make of us? And on the other hand, how do we deal with people who have a journey map laid out and a goal in mind? To me, I think these are the two options that we have before us in everything we do, not only translation. So I'd ask all of you to keep that in mind as we go along. And I thought I'd start with a brief introduction to lay out the ground that I'm going to explore, and then I'll present a roadmap about how I'll unpack these three rather forbidding sounding terms: anamnesia, resistance, cosmopolitics. I want to begin by saying that for all kinds of biographical reasons, translation has never for me been an activity extraneous to my life. It's always been anchored in deeply existential and experiential contexts of social and cultural practice. This is partly because I belong to a community, an ethnic group that has undergone experiences of diaspora several times. Also because in the last couple of generations, due to where people have settled and what cultural investments they've made, the family speaks multiple languages. I have a set of cousins who grew up speaking Hindustani, not the highly Sanskritized modern Hindi of our textbooks, which is barely 100 years old, but a proper Hindustani. On the other hand, there's a branch of the family long settled in Hyderabad, from whom I heard Dakkani, first with amusement and then with appreciation. And then there's other kinds of languages in the mix. And I grew up very much with a sense of Konkani and English as interchangeable first languages. I really never had to choose between these. So in a text I wrote again for the Goethe-Institut called Fragments from a Translator's Memoir, I wrote that I cannot remember a time when I was not involved in one form of translation or another. And I therefore take it very personally when translation and its contexts of diversity and polyglossia are threatened by forms of politics that are premised on abstractions about religious, local, national, or community identity. Abstractions that are hard-edged and exclusionary, that tend to flatten out and destroy the actual plurality of forms of being and cultural mediation and self-identifying strategies. All of the code switching that we engage in an everyday way in any reasonably complex society. So I want to suggest that we're actually confronting, as translators, as multilingual readers, just as citizens, as social subjects, we're confronting two completely opposed conceptions of language and of linguistic practice. The first one is premised on a bounded territoriality. It's also based on what I'm going to characterize, and hopefully we can discuss this, on a notion of a mystical collectivity. And here I want to say, I'll say more about this as I go along, but I think that there is a notion of language that is rather dangerous and that is sourced ultimately in the moment, in the historical moment of Romanticism. It's a legacy of colonial philology to us. It emerges from a time when the European nation states were coming into being as tightly bounded entities in a condition of antagonism, really, with one another. So there was the idea that there would be one nation, one state to control it, and one language that would unify its subjects. And that had very, very strong consequences, which I will explore as we go along. Into that mix comes print modernity, which then creates another hierarchy of languages that are available in print and languages that have non-print heritage. So this is one kind of conception of language and linguistic practice on the one hand. On the other, I think we can draw on linguistic practices, on histories of language that have to do with osmosis, that have to do with transregionality, that see language as a way of improvising our sociality, and which is therefore much more open to borrowing, whether in a lexical sense or through loan words, through vocabulary, that is much more open, in effect, where language is not a way of marking difference. Language is a way of creating bridges. So this is the broad distinction that I make. Given all of this, I would suggest that translation cannot be seen, as it tends too often to be seen, as simply a practice that is geared to teleporting texts from one language to another. You know, when we think about translation, quite often there's either an instrumental sense that, you know, this is going to be a manual where we get something from somewhere else and make it comprehensible to ourselves. Or then it becomes the subject of academic discourse where, and there is a vast academic discourse on this, as we all know, where there is a great deal of debate, there are theoretical disquisitions, there are discussions of the deficits and gains, the nuances attendant on this kind of transfer. What I would try and do today is to explore the expanded definitions of translation as an unpredictable medium. I want to think about translation as a practice that has transfigurative potential. It's not only instrumental, but it can have transfigurative, expansive effects on culture. So rather than seeing translation as a subset of cultural activity at large, I wonder if we can see translation as a superset of cultural life, as a very large matrix condition in which all our other social activity gets done. So I'm just asking you to indulge me while I flip the scale in this way. And I also want to, as I go along, I want to see if we can think about translation as both a poetics and a politics of self-dismantling and the refashioning of the self. In a way where translation isn't just a way of creating another accomplishment for ourselves, that, you know, we know another language, we can read its texts. What does that act do for us? Can it bring about change within ourselves? Can it help us to transform ourselves? How does all that happen? How does translation open us up to new questions? This is what I want to think about. And as an aside, I'm also, this may or may not have any great relevance to what I'm saying, but I also want us to remember that translation is not a secondary activity. It has been present at the originary moment of print modernity, on which so much of our present is premised. Most of us assume that that originary moment was the Gutenberg Bible in 1454. But as I go along, and I will show you a slide to that effect, the first dated printed book actually was found in a cave in the Silk Route in China, in Dunhuang. And the date from the Tang calendar is 868 CE, the 9th century. But it's a Chinese translation of the Vajracchedika. So whether it's the Chinese Vajracchedika or the German Gutenberg Bible, it's interesting that these originary moments of print modernity are moments of translation. They carry a classical language into a regional or a vernacular present. They take the classical and they revolutionize it in terms of access. And in fact, all our present notions of originality and versionality, the transfer of meaning, you could situate all of these questions in these moments. So I'm just going to ask you to hold this in mind, and to hold in mind my proposition that translation reveals language as a key battleground of the war over history and over agency. So as I go along now, I'm going to unpack these ideas that I have of anamnesia and resistance and cosmopolitics. And I'm going to get to, if I can do this properly, I'm going to share screen. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
You can see it?
Yeah.
All right. Super. Okay. Now this is, it's in the British Library, but I also have a facsimile of this first book ever to be printed. And it's one of the marvels of technology that you can actually see this. And I'm going to talk a little about it because what I want us, why I emphasize this term anamnesia is because it's a refusal to forget. It's an active commitment to recollection. Anamnesia, as many of us will know, is also the term that is used in medical science for an inventory of symptoms and tendencies, a patient's medical history. So to me, anamnesia has both of these meanings. It's a way of looking back through our histories to recover something we've forgotten. It's also a recognition that as historical subjects, as citizens, we also are prone to certain illnesses and disorders of forgetting, of toxicity, of over-assertion. And the way to figure out how to deal with this is to go back through our symptoms and look back at the past. It strikes me that one way of thinking about anamnesia is via the Sanskrit term abhijnan, the recognition, the recall of what was always known, but which can sometimes be eclipsed. You you find the magic ring and things come back to memory. So under this sign, what I want to do in the first part of my presentation today is to recall a brief genealogy of pivotal moments, of traces and experiences where translation has played a formative political role of the kind that I've indicated. So I'm going to think about 4 crucibles, as I think of them. Milieu, where collaborations, reincarnations of texts took place, doctrines were translated and taken across civilizational borderlines. I'm also going to dwell on 3 contact zones, 3 historical moments and geographical areas where these kinds of exchanges took place, where institutions were created that foregrounded and privileged translation as a basic form of human interaction and the expansion of the imagination. And I'm going to think about translation as specifically related to interlinguality, not just an in-between space of transference, but a zone of making and encounter and cultural reimagining. So this is the first of my crucibles. Aurel Stein, the Hungarian Indologist and archaeologist, used to speak of this area as Serindia, not China, not India, a zone where these cultural energies were diffused and came together. So somewhere in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, there was an interface that took place here between Mahayana Buddhism emerging from northern India and further south indeed, and imperial China. And one of the key figures in that historical moment was called Kumarajiva. He was part Kashmiri and part Kuchian. He was a monk and a prince who became a monk and a translator. And he translated the Vaipulya Sutras of Buddhism, the long sutras, into Chinese. And Vajrachedika Prajnaparamita Sutra is one of them. And the more one reads of that period, the more one comes across long Sanskrit sutras, which apparently now only exist in Chinese translation. Often the Sanskrit originals are said to have been lost. But when you look at, for instance, this particular sutra or the Vimalakirti Nirdesh, you realize very soon that they have very little in common with the much more austere, philosophically precise formulations of North Indian Mahayana Buddhism. What they have instead are extremely operatic prefaces, like the Vimalakirti Nirdesh. The Buddha doesn't just land up somewhere to talk to someone. He's accompanied by 1,000 bodhisattvas. It's operatic, it's baroque, and you suddenly realize that there probably were no Sanskrit originals, that translation here was also a political act. I mean, when you're dealing with the Tang imperial court, simplicity is not the way to go. So clearly, the sutras were expanded, elaborated, and represented for a new audience with a certain degree of sumptuousness that would capture the attention of the intended patrons and audiences. So here I would think about this act of translation as an imaginative extension of the original, adapted for the recipient sensibility. So it's not simply something being taken from a donor culture and being presented to a receiving culture. Something has changed in that transition, and the very text has changed. So this is not just translation, it's what the late Professor P. Lal used to refer to as transcreation, but it has very definite political implications. So I would ask you to hold in mind this model of translation and its implications. Oopsie. Okay. I'm moving now to another time and place, another crucible. This is the Baghdad of the 8th and 9th centuries. It was ruled, as many of you will know, by the Abbasid dynasty at this time. And the Abbasids, particularly the Caliphs Mansur and Harun al-Rashid, were great patrons of learning. It also helped that in their intellectual ambitions, they were supported by a very particular vizierial dynasty, who we know through fairy tales, sometimes as the Barmecides. They were descended actually from a lineage of Buddhist abbots in present-day Balkh. So it's the Sanskrit word paramaka that gets translated as al-Barmaki in Arabic. And thanks to this Barmecidal paramaka connection, the Abbasid Caliphate opens itself up to a whole range of texts and narratives that come out of the Sanskrit and Prakrit traditions. They are equally open on the Western side to the Greek classics that are being lost. And what they do here in a situation such as this, which is multilingual, which is full of research questions and intellectual inquiry, is that the Abbasid Caliphs create this institution called the Bayt-ul-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. And this is where you have Sanskrit texts at one level, texts like the Panchatantra turn into the Dastan Kalila Vadimna. The Charak Samhita gets translated. From the Greek tradition, you have Galen being translated, also the works of Plato and of Aristotle. All of these get translated into Arabic, and they then travel across the world of Islam, across the Levant and North Africa into Spain, which at that point is, of course, going to turn into Al-Andalus. And it's this transcontinental transmission of texts through translation that I've been fascinated by for a very long time. It forms one of the sections in a book called Kamfab Saga, which Ilya Troyanov and I wrote a long time ago, where we were dwelling on the traveling afterlives and the rebirths of these texts in a way where fables and parables born in one culture and society eventually are reborn in other forms elsewhere. It's the reason why Boccaccio and Chaucer, for instance, have so many episodes that ultimately are, rooted in the Jatakas or in the Panchatantra or in the outlying episodes of the Ramayana. They all went through this Abbasid route through to Al-Andalus, through a Jewish storyteller called Petrus Alfonsi, and then were disseminated into English, Welsh, French, Italian, and so on. So the reason I would like to underscore this historical moment in this crucible is because we need to retrieve a history that has dropped out of sight. This is the moment of the efflorescence of Islamic science, philosophy, and inquiry. It's at an institution like the Bayt-ul-Hikmah that thinkers like Al-Razi and Al-Kindi, Al-Khwarizmi really did their work. These are the institutions, these are the processes of translation that sustained later thinkers like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. So here again, I would like us to look at the history of translation with a view to also thinking about how translation was a force of transformation, that eventually, if you follow this line far enough, it leads straight to the humanism of the Renaissance, with all of the emphasis on philosophical inquiry, the balancing of doubt and wonder that it carries. Following that history a little further, I come to another crucible, which was Toledo in the 12th and 13th centuries, where at first a Catholic bishop called Raimond, and later the king who you see here in the slide, Alfonso the Wise, Alfonso X, in two different phases, supported a culture of translation. And it was exactly what it says, that the Escuela de Traductores, the school of translators, where you had both an awareness that there were great texts that had been saved. Really, remember that what Europe for a long time called the Dark Ages was a time of intellectual richness in the Islamic world. So the transfer of knowledge at this point is really from the House of Islam to a Europe that is gradually emerging from clerisy, from clerical authoritarianism of a certain kind. So what you have here are Jewish, Muslim, and Christian translators working together. And you have the rise of a model of translation, team translation, that really is most effectively seen in the work that got done in Toledo, where you had people working together. One translator would translate from the Arabic into Latin. The Latin specialist would then see how that worked. So really, these are people working between Greek, Arabic, and Latin. And those processes eventually support the emergence of the European vernaculars. So usually the way we think about how the modern European languages emerged is we tend to source them back to Latin, to Greek, to Germanic sources in the north. But not often do we see that this very strong presence of Arabic as a linguistic medium, as a lingua franca, a lingua arabica, played a great role in how this whole process got set in motion in the first place. Closer home, my fourth crucible for translation is the Ibadat Khana. You see here, thanks to the processes of colonialism, many of our key images no longer reside with us, but thanks to Wikimedia Commons, we have them here. So what you have here is, of course, the Emperor Akbar, celebrated for his openness and responsiveness to multiple languages, multiple creeds, actively pursuing the mode of dialogue. And we know that it was at this point that the great Mughal projects of translating the Sanskrit epics and the Sanskrit story cycles got set in motion. The Mahabharata becomes the Razmnama, the Ramayana is translated for the emperor's mother, the Panchatantra reappears as again, the Panchatantra is again opened up and becomes the Anvar-e-Suhaili, and a whole range of other. For some reason, the Yog Vasisht is very popular with the Mughal emperors. Translations are commissioned by Akbar, by Jahangir, by Shah Jahan, three emperors in each generation who turned back to this text of dream knowledge. And you also find that at this point, there are people at court who are working in multiple languages. Abdur Rahim Khan Khana, who is practically the emperor's cousin, is the most powerful Mughal courtier, but he also writes in Braj. He's a Braj poet, Rahim Das. So I'm asking us to keep this in mind, thinking of a tradition from Akbar to Dara Shikoh, where translation is the vehicle of intercultural, transcultural curiosity. It becomes a seedbed of ideas. It becomes also a way of creating a new kind of ecumeny of subjects who may be drawn from different religions and different languages, But translation here plays the extremely important role of forming common ground. And I hope we can discuss some of these questions as we go along. I'm moving now to the notion of contact zones. I want to think about three different historical periods where at the point of contact between dissimilar cultures, dissimilar polities and languages, you still had the seeking for common ground. What does that say for our now seemingly sedimented conceptions of identity and location? How might we, by looking back at these moments of translation, question our static, territorial, essentialist ideas of who we are? And how might we think about how translation has played a key role in adaptation and improvisation? So this picture that you're looking at is Ashoka's bilingual Kandahar edict, rendered in Greek and in Aramaic. It's 258 BC. We all know Ashoka's story, and we usually think of the edicts essentially as extending to the present day India. But these edicts, which were discovered much later in present day Afghanistan, present us with an image of the emperor speaking to his Greek-speaking and Greek-reading subjects in the Northwest. As we know, the Greeks came in, they settled, they intermarried. So there was this large population of people to whom Greek and Aramaic were their first language. But something very, very intriguing happens here, because in most of the other edicts, which are Magadhi, the text is very clear. Here, something else happens, because the language Greek arrives with its own theology. It arrives with its own sense of religion. So the central category of Ashoka's edicts, dharma, is rendered as something else in the Greek. It's rendered as Eusebia, which is not Dhamma. Dhamma is terribly difficult to translate, but we broadly understand it as a code of ethics, which is based on compassion, on the understanding of the interrelationship of beings, but it is not dependent on an external God. There is no external God in Buddhist doctrine. Eusebia, on the other hand, is a Greek term meaning piety in order to honor the gods. So it's a radically different theology. So it's not a one-to-one correspondence between Dhamma and a Greek term. So what you have on the one hand is literally an irreconcilability of ideas. What could have been a gap between what the emperor was trying to say and what his subjects had in mind. But you have here a certain leeway where the emperor uses a term that would be comprehensible to the people there, to his subjects. So whilst not insisting in a doctrinaire way on the absolute nature of his idea, in the spirit of Dhamma, he actually reaches out to take word from their language so that broadly this idea would be understood. And so here again, we have a different model of translation that takes into account socio-linguistic contexts and which allows for a certain leeway, does not insist in an absolutist way on the primacy of exact meaning. So I'm asking you to hold that in mind. I come now to another of these contact zone examples in mind. This is Bactrian Greek coinage from 100 BC. We're looking at a long-forgotten emperor called Polyxenos, which strangely means strange in many ways, a stranger many times over. And I think that's quite an intriguing name for this king to have had. But if you look at his coinage, what it has in Greek and on its obverse is the emperor declaring himself to be Basileo, to be Soter. So he is both emperor and savior. And then on the reverse, you have the Indic text, which has the emperor calling himself a Tratara. So what you have here in this model of kingship at the border between the Indian, the Persian, and the Greek worlds is a whole emerging new theology and politics. And the vehicle for this emerging theology is translation, because you're looking at different forms of cosmology, different kinds of religion, And this notion of a divine kingship that is emerging is drawing on a traditional Greek idea, the basileus, the emperor, the human emperor, but also on the idea of the king as the savior, as the redeemer, the tratar. That is a Mahayana idea. And you suddenly have this notion of these coins in general currency, people looking at them. How many of them looked at this? One doesn't know, and took away what was being said. But we know that it is part of a larger ideology where there was this transmigration of ideas and new words, new forms of linguistic understanding were coming into being at this point. And I take this set of transactions further with my last example for these contact zones, which is Ghaznavid coinage in both the Arabic and the Sharda script from very early in the 12th century. Now, this is a contested period, especially at our present time in the history of modern post-colonial India, where it is to this time that all manner of horrors are ascribed. This is our friends in power will tell us that this is the moment where invaders arrive with a new religion and all of this. This coin actually tells us a slightly different story of how this might have got done. It is, to put it in a far more objective manner, these are the early Turkic invasions. They mark the advent of Islam in Northwest India. Islam, meanwhile, has come in with traders to the West Coast centuries before. It is part of the fabric of the Indian Ocean world. What you're looking at here in the Arabic is actually the kalima. It says, and on the other side, it appears in Sharda script and in Sanskrit. And I'll read you what the Sanskrit says. It says, Avyaktam Ekam, Muhammad Avatar, Mahmud and Rupati. And I just think about it. It is the kalima, it's the shahada, two of the terms. It effectively proclaims that the inexpressible is one. Avyaktam Ekam, La ilaha illallah. There is no God but the one. The second term which I want to dwell on is very intriguing. Imagine to yourselves these Sanskrit writers of this early time thinking about Muhammadur Rasulullah. The Prophet Muhammad is the messenger of God. Their version of that is Muhammad Avatar. Now, again, think about what is going on here. It is an extraordinary liberty taken with theology, but for very definite political reasons. Because in the Sanskrit, if you were to say Duta, messenger, in the world of Sanskrit politics and hierarchies, that doesn't count for very much. It means a great deal in the Abrahamic religions, the messenger of God has great power and potency. So what the Sanskrit translators do here is to tweak and create a term which has meaning for their audiences, where they say Muhammad is an avatar of God. And from a strictly Islamic point of view, this is heresy, it's unthinkable. But to this early Ghaznavid regime, which is trying to make its home in a new place and work out a kind of working relationship with new subjects, it's a whole new polity coming to shape. This is a liberty worth taking because it carries prestige for the new regime and its religion. So this is something I'd ask you to hold in mind. The kinds of shifts that we've had, the translation bears witness to, where both with Ashoka and his Greek translation of Dhamma introduced there, here the Duta being replaced by the Avatar, you see how translation is deeply, deeply political in a granular way. Now, you might say to yourselves, well, we're just looking at these old coins in a museum. I'm asking you to recapture a life world where there was far more openness, there was more responsiveness. We tend to overemphasize the violence and the destructiveness of historical periods. I'm making a gentle plea for the kinds of dialogue, communion, and ultimately a form of shared social life, a shared sociality that emerged from these historical moments. And I think that is the heritage worth thinking about and worth holding on to. I'm going to leave this here while I talk about part two. I've come to part two of my roadmap, which is resistance. And I want to carry all of these thoughts that I've tried to share into thinking about how translation can become a... Do you have a question?
If you could stop sharing the screen, then we
okay,
can see you on the full screen.
Yeah. All righty. I had to achieve that by some magical means. Oh, that's easy. There we go. Okay. So I'm now carrying with us these histories of translation. I'm wondering how we can question the complicity of linguistic reform or modernization in the large-scale programs of the state apparatus that have been such a part of modernity. Because I believe that they've actually made for a certain linguistic impoverishment. And I'll say more about this. And what I've tried to show is that in so-called pre-modern times, trans-regionality, the osmosis between languages, a willingness to translate in transformative ways, all this was very much part of the way in which people used language and used translation. Over against that, I think we have in modern times, thanks to this nexus that I indicated between Romanticism, the rise of the modern nation state, and a certain kind of philology, I think what we've committed ourselves to is very, very static notions that are dangerous for linguistic diversity. I'm thinking, for instance, of how very strong the idea is today of the mother tongue and how it has been insistently weaponized as a tool of mass mobilization. And it may come as a surprise to many people, but there is no term for the mother tongue in any Indian language before the arrival of colonial philology. Terms like Madhuri Zuban and Matra Bhasha are calques. They are calques from Muttersprache, or mother tongue. And Sheldon Pollock writes beautifully about this in his work on Sanskrit, the language of the gods and the world of men. The reason we don't have that term is because it wasn't needed. Many South Asians, even as they do today, had multiple first language capabilities. And they use different languages in different social contexts. And most of the writing, a lot of the literary expression was eventually done in a formal court language or a public language. Later, with the rise of what we sometimes call the vernaculars, there's a new kind of turn. And that is yet not the mother tongue as such. It's still one language among others. It's still the case that Rekhta poets are working with Persian at the back of their minds. Braj poets are working with Sanskrit at the back of their minds. So I want us to be able to rethink this idea of the mother tongue as something primordial and ever present, because it's also linked to our obsessions with an official or a national language. Why on earth would a highly polyglot, multilingual society need to have some singular language as its national language? We have to rethink these things, because within such conceptions lie the seeds of othering and of violence. And I also want to pin this to the case of Hindi in particular, because somehow, usually we tend to think about this as, language politics is usually cast as English versus everybody else. But I think what we've tended to do is also from roughly 1858 to the present, the way in which we've created certain singular regional languages has come at the cost of the other languages in a continuum. So I'll take Hindi as my case for that. What we call Hindi today, as I was saying earlier, is really little over 100 years ago. It comes from a historical moment when a very particular set of thinkers in the north, Bhartendu Harishchandra, Pratap Narayan Mishra, for instance, and other later figures, very, very deliberately moved Hindi away from its diversity and chose Khadi Boli as a basis and Sanskrit for its vocabulary. And that's produced this modern Hindi. But what that has done is to derogate Bundeli, Maithili, a whole series of languages in Rajasthan, Braj, Awadhi, and a whole, I can think of it, it's actually 18 or 19 languages in that spectrum, which have all been diminished. And that is extraordinary because these languages have their own literatures. They have literatures going back centuries. Those literatures have appeared in oral, scribal, performative contexts. But they're all now derogated because you have this idea of a singular Hindi. And I'm quite certain that the same logic has been at work in other regions too. For instance, Marathi, one senses the same thing. There's a particular kind of high Sanskrita, a Hanover model, if you will, which is put in place. And that comes at the cost of Ahirani, Malwani, all kinds of other languages which have their own literatures. You may now want to see them as dialects. I would also question the notion of a dialect. I would much rather think of linguistic continua and different languages within such continua. So in this section of what I have to say, I would think of how translation could actually help us resist this kind of linguistic flattening. How could translation reach out and address the loss of texture and granularity? How can translation act within the scenario of the death of languages to bring back to center stage languages and literatures that are being marginalized, pushed to the corner? It seems a slightly eccentric procedure. For instance, if you say, now, if I translate from the Ahirani into English, what does that do for Ahirani? And now a friend and colleague of mine, Anjali Purohit, has just done exactly that. She's translated the works of a Bhakti saint poet quite recent times, Bahina Bai, from Ahirani into English. Now you might say, well, it's gone into a global language. What happens now? My response would be it at least makes people aware that there is this language called Ahirani and that it has texts, compositions worth looking at. And it may open the door to a recognition of these other languages, and people might eventually want to go back, look at these language troves. So it's in an invitational spirit of hope that I think translation can definitely work. And also just in terms of, in the artisanal work of translation, I'm sure we've all faced this as translators. It's the hidden histories. It's what's been eclipsed. It's the archaeology of a language that comes to light. You stumble upon a loan word and you say to yourself, goodness, where did that come from? Or you come upon an older stratum of a language and suddenly you wonder where that came from. I think these are not merely academic activities. They actually help us understand the trajectory of these languages and why it's so important to go back and to retrieve and to bring back to light and to recognize our plurality that's within. It's not just, doesn't come externally from policy, it's in what we speak. And I'll conclude now by going to this, I'll float this notion of what I mean by cosmopolitics and why I think translation is so important. Very often when we think of being cosmopolitan, it comes with some notion of privilege. It's the idea that one is at ease in multiple contexts, one has accomplishments in the form of the languages one speaks. And all of that depends on our privileging of cosmos, the cosmos part of it, the world. I don't think we pay enough attention to the politics part. Cosmopolitan, you're a citizen of the world. If you're a citizen, you have duties, you have rights, duties, obligations. And it's not a simple complacent cosmopolitanism that I'm thinking of here. I'm thinking of something that is always active, a politics of being at home in many places, which also means reaching out to the crises of other people too. It's not an innocent act to read in translation the work of a Santhal colleague, for instance. By reading that, you stand alongside that writer. You understand and extend yourself in empathy with the crises that this writer and her or their people have gone through. So to me, this is at the heart of translation, this ability to release yourself to other persons, other situations, other predicaments. And therefore, as a project, I think Cosmopolitics really, really undergirds responsible translation. And I want to see if we can, I hope we can talk about this. I want to see how this sits alongside Goethe's idea of Weltliteratur. it's very fashionable to dismiss and laugh at this idea. But if you go back to Goethe, as many of you have undoubtedly done, you'll see that this too is not, there's nothing naive about this idea of Weltliteratur, which is quite genuinely a commitment to giving up one's notion of a sovereign presence in the world. Now, why would Goethe, for instance, say to himself, okay, East-West Divan, someone like Goethe or anyone in that constellation could easily have been very complacent in themselves. Why is it that he and his intellectual heirs are looking elsewhere to seek the knowledge, the wisdom, the artisanal forms of elsewhere? This is an ethical stance, and it's something that we need to retrieve. It's not an expression of cultural sovereignty. It's an expression of an ability to give up your sovereignty and become an apprentice again, or an acolyte, or a student, or even a listener in someone else's linguistic zone and literary tradition. Which now leads me, I realize I've had a very, I've done a whole series of detours here, but I think we are being invited by this account of translation to rethink ourselves, literally. Because as heirs to the Enlightenment, as people whose default thinking comes from the Enlightenment, we're very proud of being individuals. And there's nothing wrong with it. Of course, the Enlightenment gave us this notion of the sanctity of the individual, the rule of law, justice, natural justice, and all of this, which is crucial. But what it could also have done is to make us think of ourselves as fairly watertight. Over against that, I would place an idea that Deleuze and Guattari set in motion of individuality. What if we see ourselves as individuals, as being made up of a kaleidoscope of different impulses, as bearers of plural histories? So what I've tried to do, especially through these images and what I spoke over the slides, is to see if we can expand ourselves imaginatively, to see ourselves as individuals. And how might that work in terms of our acceptance of otherness, of difference? And I think this is the best way for us to really be better translators. So provocatively, I'm going to end by saying that against notions of xenophobia, I'm going to propose xenophilia as an active, generative condition. And that I think that in order to be good translators, we really need to be xenophilic rather than xenophobic. And I think this might work well, both in terms of our attentiveness to the texts we translate and our sense of why we do this and why this is so incredibly crucial. Thank you very much. You've been an incredibly indulgent and patient audience. Thank you so much.
That was quite a lecture. I'm really, really grateful, Ranjit, for a wonderful journey you took us. Let us come to this fabulous lecture that we have just heard, situating translation. And I will be a little do a bit of anamnesistic activity and recollect what you have just said. I'll try to do it in a couple of minutes, which would be about beginning with your existential situation, which is, many of us, maybe all of us, share in that situation somewhat, at least, that we are at home in more than one language, and talking about language not as a way of marking difference, but as a way of building a bridge to the other, And in that sense, of course, translation as an activity, as a praxis, has less of an instrumental value and more of a transfigurative value that you have very, very clearly and very beautifully brought out through all the examples that we saw. And I think it was a lot of it was new for me as well, and I am very grateful to have heard that. Also, translation not as a subset of culture or cultural activity, but as in fact a primary activity that has a decisive role in shaping cultures as they emerge. Then we went through the fascinating accounts of the Vajrachedika and the Baitul Hikmah, then what happened in Toledo, the team translation, Greek, Arabic, and Latin, then the Ibadat Khana of Akbar in Fatehpur Sikri, and among all these crucibles also Ashoka's edicts for his Greek and Armenian speaking subjects in the Northwest, in Kandahar. And very beautifully you brought it to the point about being a little flexible, about the insistence on the exact meaning, or rendering Dhamma, for example, for his Greek-speaking subjects, and that there was a certain pragmatism about translating that into a language that they could understand. So this journey then took us to Polixenos and the bilingual coins, and the Ghaznavid coins were, of course, a wonderful revelation as well. After that, I mean, Muhammad as the avatar and not as the Rasulullah, or the messenger of God. Then in modern times, the idea of the mother tongue, and whether we really need the idea, the obsession with a single language, and which, of course, has its own very chauvinistic, I would say, politics around it, and that how that leads to othering, which in itself is violence. I mean, first of all, I mean, it leads to further violence is, of course, something that is true, but that itself is violence. And then the example of a singular Hindi rather than the 19 or 20 different languages spoken across that belt of India. And then coming to the idea of cosmopolitics, where invoking Goethe and perhaps also implying that rather than interculturality, there is a transculturality at the heart of cosmopolitics, and insurgent cosmopolitics, as you call it, which undergirds responsible translation. I think responsible translation is also an important term that you have mentioned in this towards the end of this lecture. I think we could develop on that as well, what it implies, what is responsible translation. And then ending with Deleuze and Guattari's idea of individuality, and I mean, celebrating, also in a sense, celebrating rootlessness, I would say. And so this is what I have noted down during your lecture. I also have some points which I would like to just mention here for discussion. So there are a couple of references which I went back to when I read the abstract of Ranjit's lecture, and so I'll just go through the few points that I have noted down, and maybe then open up the floor for a discussion, because I think the people who are in the audience are active translators. I think they should come into the picture, into discussion as quickly as possible. So first one is a quote from Octavio Paz, which is, no text is entirely original, because language itself, in its essence, is already a translation. And again, all texts are original, because every translation is distinctive, unquote. So once the authority of the original is decentered, then the proverbial 1,000 flowers can bloom. But this is not a license for anything goes. The process of translation is imbued with an ethics of self-reflexivity. Like Hermann Broch says, the exhortation to the artist should be Arbeite gut, and not nicht erzeuge das Schöne, because that would definitely lead to kitsch. That is his commandment to the artist. So in that sense, I'm saying this sense of gut arbeiten is implied when I say an ethics of self-reflexivity. Second point, translation as a process is the recognition and acceptance of the humanity and the equalness of the other. It is an acceptance that to be human is to be syncretic, individual in that sense. Like Ranjit himself describes Lalla in the introduction of his translation of her poems, and I'm quoting, it would be most productive to view her as a figure whose ideas straddle the domains of Kashmir Shaivism, Tantra, Yoga, and Yogacara Buddhism, and who appears to have been socially acquainted with the ideas and practices of the Sufis, unquote. Or the way she, like Kabir with his torch, attacks, quote, the parasitic forms of organized religion that have attached themselves to the spiritual quest and choked it. Arid scholarship, soulless ritualism, fetishized austerity, and animal sacrifice, unquote. Next point. Translation, almost like an adventure, the act of translation is a willingness to give up the safe harbor of one's native everything and take a leap to try to grasp the other. I'm using the word grasp as used by Dilip Chitre in his introduction. Grasp the other, but without destroying, without deforming either. I came across a very interesting, it was just a coincident small lecture by John Le Carre that I came across, which he gave to teachers of German in London. Okay, so that is and there he calls teaching learning of a foreign language, of anything new, of a language, in fact, as an act of friendship. I really like that formulation, that teaching learning is another language, is an act of friendship. And from taking off from that, I'm wondering whether translation might be one of love, because that brings me to Dilip Chitre's recently discussed preface to Jnanadeva's Anubhavamrit, and I'm quoting from that. Translation as a quote, complex meta-text. I think that was implied in Ranjit's lecture today also, as a complex meta-text that can give birth to a whole interrelated and yet variegated family of target language texts, reaching different target audiences and attracting them ideally towards the alien universe of the source text and its language, desiring intimacy with it. It was a very beautiful unquote. That's a very beautiful way to put it, desiring intimacy with it. Ranjit has talked about an insurgent cosmopolitics today at the end of his lecture. As uncompromising as it is, this insurgent cosmopolitics is, I feel, pacifist, democratic, and democratizing. And this, again, I'm using ideas from Hermann Broch's lecture on the technique and philosophy of translation, where he calls it a pacifist democratic mission, translation. At the same time, this insurgence is also one into oneself, an insurgent into oneself, remembering and recovering the forgotten, repressed other in the self. So translation as primarily a hermeneutic process. Goethe's world literature, Weltbürgertum, cosmopolitanism, the praxis of translation is at the heart of his transcendence and transgression of nationalistic narrow-mindedness. In fact, I was telling Jayashree just before we began that one quote of Goethe's from 1828, which I found was, and I'm quoting him, here we note something new, perhaps scarcely felt and never expressed before, that the translator is working not for his own nation alone, but also for the nation from whose language he takes the work. And that, with that, I will end my quote unquote intervention here. And just want to say, I mean, even the idea of globalization that comes through in Marx and Engels's version of it in the manifesto also has a very interesting dimension to it in terms of world literature, because they do talk about world literature also. Yeah, so I hope I have done justice to a wonderful lecture that we've just heard. And with these points, I will just say, Jayashree, I think we should do this for with once again a big thanks to Ranjit and to you and Mansi also for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Milind. That was a wonderful response. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah, so the floor is open. Milind, I would like to know if G.A. Kulkarni, who was a brilliant translator himself, he had expressed some views regarding the act of translation, art or science of translation, or the process of translation. Do you recall anything?
No.
Not on the spot. Okay, but that could be one point. Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
Amnesia. Okay, not
yes.
anamnesia.
No,
My
no.
God, Ranjit, actually, I searched for the correct pronunciation of this word,
Oh my
anamnesia
God.
or anamnesia. Because that's
No,
where the translation starts, Yeah.
I can recall J. Kulkarni's ideas about art as such, about literature as such, but not about translation.
Yeah, so I invite the mentors and translators to for questions, remarks, observations. Professor Dengle, please, Rajendra Dengle.
I thank you so much, Ranjit Hoskote, for an absolutely wonderful lecture. I learned a lot from this. I think the key word, has been transformation. And translation as an activity transforms not only the object of translation, that is the text, but also the subject of translation, also the translator himself. And I think it's very important, and that's where I come to this major hindrance in this activity, and why translation activity then becomes a very mechanical, quote unquote, professional, commissioned translation and so on, is perhaps that I refuse to. I'm in total denial as far as how my mind works. My mind is acts in two modes. One is to collect, and the other one is to project. And I find that this recollection, remembering, Erinnerung, and so on. These are wonderful words, but I choose to forget that there is something called resentment. That my mind primarily collects and projects negativity, resentment, and unless and until I am willing to do something about my resentment, I will not be a creative translator. I will not be willing to transform myself or my world. I choose to, and we see it all around ourselves. I think the main motor of our activity is resentment, viciousness, anger. For what? Against what? And if I am not willing to address these things in my mind, it's very difficult for me to enjoy this whole business of this wonderful activity called translation. And I'm going to choose only those texts, which will make me justify my resentment. I will not choose texts which are which question this whole business, like you are suggesting. And I think it's a very important thing, and particularly in the context of this digital academy of translation, I think it's very important that we put our minds together and find out how much of we are victimizing ourselves, not victimizing anything else, but allowing this whole business of resentment to occupy that space, in my consciousness. And therefore, this wonderful thing that Harald Weinrich talks about, these two mythical rivers in Greek mythology, Mnemosyne and Lethe, that they come very close to each other, they almost touch each other, and that is the space called, that was a space which was discovered by the geographer Pausanias, and that's why that's the pause. It's very difficult for me to take a pause and reflect, introspect. I think primary basic requirements of me as a translator. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a ringing and resonant manifesto for how to go ahead and fight ressentiment and to question our own toxicity and why we need to overcome that and ask these questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think I will ask Harsh's question. Ranjit, to you, what has been the most challenging text you have translated and why? And there is question 2 from me. The text of Lal Ded, And Laleshwari's translation was ready, I heard, in 1991 itself, but you held on to it because you felt it was not ready.
Right.
So maybe you can club both answers together, because what made you feel that it was not ready, and whether you, yeah. Over to you.
What you've brought to the table, what Harsha has asked, and some of the other questions that emerge, actually all of that I can respond to this. What happened in 1991 is that I was learning Kashmiri, I had this great surge of relearning, if you will. I had this great surge of enthusiasm, and I went at the text in a certain way, and it was an athletic kind of approach. And as I finished it, I said to myself, for one, this surge of enthusiasm has got me through this. But what have I done? I realized I knew, as I was doing it, I knew that I was not comfortable with what seemed to be overtly sacred elements there. And I was at that point still a student. I was still at university. I was in the throes of a certain kind of politics. And I thought to myself, this is not about whether I'm comfortable or not. I have to be true to this text and its context. It was also a time, and it was probably one of the very worst years. Every year in Kashmir has been terrible for a long time, but there was a great deal of turbulence at that point. And I thought to myself, this text has to be responsive as a translation. It has to be, it's being brought into a world where the place from which the text came is in this kind of turbulence. And for those reasons, I said, this is simply not the right, I have to revisit. I went over the ground, and I continued to go over the ground, and it took 20 years then, because I realized that I had to be broken and remade in order to achieve that translation. So my view, in those years, I also became the Times of India's first religion and philosophy editor, among other things. So which brought me not just that particular job, but the fact of my immersion in the sacred traditions also brought me to a new understanding of what is really going on with these texts, what was happening in the 14th century. And just the linguistic evidence. The deeper I looked at each single vark, it was very, very clear that it was not composed by a single person. It bore very, very definite emphases that showed that multiple people had worked on this, people of different religions, different genders, different time frames, the vocabulary shifts, which eventually allowed me to present a far more vibrant and meaningful account, rather than if I just rushed into print, it would have been fine. Well, translation of Lala, great. Grierson has done it, various people have done it. It would have brought nothing new to the table, other than given me some satisfaction of having done it in an athletic spirit. Completely useless to me and to anyone else. What eventually happened, I think, through this process was that I was also able to bear witness to linguistic complexity, present a model for that, for how, in fact, what I call a contributory lineage was the collective authorship of this tradition. Mm. It made for, I think it opened up a number of questions also about linguistic practice in Kashmir, code switching. It eventually wasn't just about the text. It was about bearing witness to the complex contexts of the text, social, cultural, political. And so it was in many ways the toughest text I've ever had to translate. It also involved creating a concordance among earlier editions. So as a poet, as someone committed to the life of scholarship, as a translator, in every way, I found myself, literally, as I say in the introduction, broken and remade. And I think it taught me very, very clearly that, we have to approach translation in a spirit of humility. I think there tend to be there have been historically translators who arrive as conquistadors. This is absolutely not the right way to go about things.
Thank you, Ranjit. I think Aruna Dhere has translated Lalla into Marathi. It would be a good idea to bring both of you together and talk about the translation challenges in these two languages as well. It was wonderful. There are many comments that are appreciating the content and the presentation of your lecture. And we are going to meet again in this space, but hopefully as we say, on site, in person now. And until then, Auf Wiedersehen, Ranjit. Thank you for being there.
Thank
Bis zum
you.
nächsten Mal, Ranjit. Auf Wiedersehen.
Absolutely. Auf Wiedersehen. Thank you
Auf
all.
Wiedersehen.
Bye.
Bye.